Tolu pressed the back of her hand against her forehead, brushing away sweat as the relentless midday sun beat down on her modest food stall in bustling Sango City. The patched wooden structure, barely sheltering her small enterprise, was her lifeline and the heart of her dream. A faded, hand-painted sign reading "Tolu's Kitchen" hung above the counter, a reminder of the hope and hard work that kept her going. In the back of her mind, she recalled her mother's voice, "Your gift will make a way for you, my daughter." A promise that burned like a steady ember, even in the dusty, chaotic heart of Sango City. "Tolu!" a raspy voice called out. It was Uncle Bala, a familiar figure in the neighborhood, who eagerly ordered another plate of pepper soup. "The last one nearly made me cry with joy," he joked. Laughing, Tolu scooped a generous ladle of pepper soup into a steaming bowl and passed it to a young helper. "I'm not watering it down for you," she teased. Uncle Bala responded with a playful salute, drawing more laughter from the gathering crowd. Her heart swelled with pride, remembering how her late mother had taught her to cook with passion and care. Each dish was a tribute to those early memories, the gentle humming in her mother's kitchen, the rhythmic chopping of fresh peppers, and the bittersweet stories of a father she'd never met. Lifting the lid of a large aluminum pot, she stirred a thick, simmering stew. Regulars gathered on a worn bench near the stall, exchanging banter in a mix of Yoruba and English, their voices rising and falling like the tide. Despite the strain of a long day, Tolu couldn't help but smile as she immersed herself in the life of the bustling street. Amidst the commotion, Tolu caught sight of Kunle weaving through the lunchtime crowd. Tall and lean, clad in a short-sleeved shirt, he carried a rolled-up blueprint. An architect by trade, Kunle had wandered into her stall months ago and stayed ever since. Something in his sincere, curious eyes had kindled a quiet connection between them. Stepping up to the worn counter, Kunle smiled warmly. "Hey, Tolu," he greeted, unfolding the paper to reveal neat lines and precise angles. "Remember that community park project I mentioned? I brought the layout if you want to take a look." Tolu wiped her hands on her apron before leaning in. The design showcased a sprawling green space with meandering walkways and a small amphitheater. "Looks impressive," she said softly. "Maybe you could leave a corner for folks like me to serve a proper meal." Kunle's eyes lit up. "I was hoping you'd say that. We might need refreshments when the park opens. Who better to feed everyone than the best cook in Sango City?" Feigning disbelief, Tolu chuckled. "Keep calling me the best cook, and I might start to believe it." For a moment, the air between them thickened with unspoken understanding. Her cheeks warmed as she turned to serve a customer demanding a plate of jollof rice. "Coming right up," she said, ladling the bright orange dish into a plastic container. Even as the chatter of the stall swirled around her, she felt Kunle's steady gaze beside her. Breaking the silence, he asked, "So, do you think you'll expand soon? Make Tolu's Kitchen more permanent? You deserve it." Sighing as she snapped a lid onto a container, Tolu confessed, "If only it were that simple. Permits, rent, and the cost of a bigger space. It's a constant struggle just to keep this stall running." Gently brushing a stray braid from her face, Kunle murmured, "I believe in you. If anyone can do it, it's you." His words, a rare dose of encouragement, made her heart flutter. "Thank you," she replied softly. As another wave of customers surged in, the fleeting moment of intimacy dissolved into the everyday bustle. Tolu refocused on the rush of orders ahead, though Kunle's kind words lingered in her thoughts. Amid the clatter of plates and calls for jollof, a familiar worry surfaced. Could she ever transform this tiny stall into the restaurant of her dreams? Tolu found solace in her routine. At dusk, once the frantic rush faded, she tidied her stall, stacked empty cooler boxes, and walked through the crowded market to buy supplies. In Sango City, the market never truly slept. There was always someone selling peppers, onions, or fish at bargain prices as closing time approached. The hustle perfectly matched Tolu's spirited nature. Yet, this evening felt different. A subtle buzz of unease ran beneath the usual market chatter. Shop owners whispered about new council regulations while some stalls began displaying "for rent" signs, as if bracing for an oncoming storm. Rumors floated about a beautification campaign that might soon ban roadside vending. Determined not to be distracted, Tolu pressed on. She needed fresh tomatoes, Scotch bonnet peppers, and perhaps some goat meat if she could find a good deal. At the far end of the market, she spotted a familiar face leaning against a lamppost, scanning the crowd. Kunle greeted her with a small wave. "I had a feeling you'd come this way," he said. Tolu paused, a basket of tomatoes tucked under her arm. "You again," she teased. "Should I start charging you for stalking me?" Kunle chuckled as he pushed off the lamppost. "If it means I get to see you more often, I might be willing to pay." They fell into step together, navigating around a group of boisterous teenagers. The market's makeshift stalls were illuminated by flickering bulbs as nighttime lights cast long shadows across the packed dirt. Vendors called out their last deals while the sky deepened to an indigo hue. Lowering her voice, Tolu confessed, "I heard some rumors earlier, something about a crackdown on street businesses. Do you know anything about it?" Kunle frowned, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I've heard bits and pieces. A new city development plan. The local government wants to clear roadside stalls to reduce congestion. They claim it's for safety and aesthetics, but—" He hesitated. "It could affect people like you." Tolu's grip tightened on her basket. She'd heard similar stories before, but this time the worry felt heavier. "They can't just uproot our livelihoods, can they?" Kunle's expression grew somber. "Sango City often pursues big projects that leave the less fortunate behind. I don't want that to happen to you." They stopped at a vendor selling plump red tomatoes. The vendor, recognizing Tolu, offered her a discount. While she accepted, her thoughts remained on Kunle's warning. Tolu had poured her heart into her stall. If the city council followed through on these threats, she could lose everything: her income, her footing, and the dream she'd nurtured since childhood. As they left the market, Kunle insisted on carrying her basket. The crunch of gravel filled the silence until Tolu broke it softly. "I can't lose my stall, Kunle. My mother always believed I'd do something big with my cooking. Without her, without this, I'd have nothing." He slowed, watching her with concern. "You'd still have yourself and your talent. There's more to your story than just this stall." Before she could mention her absent father, Tolu's gaze fell on a poster taped to a wall under a buzzing lamp. "Beautification Project. All roadside vendors must relocate within 30 days or face penalties." Her breath caught. This wasn't just a rumor, it was official. 1 month to find a new place, or lose everything, she murmured. Kunle touched her shoulder gently. "We'll figure something out. You have me, and you have your community." In that quiet, anxious moment, Tolu vowed silently that she would find a way to protect her legacy, no matter what it took. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains, rousing Tolu from a restless sleep. Her shoulders ached, as if heavy burdens had pressed on her in dreams. Rolling over, she recalled the poster from last night, a stark notice that roadside stalls would be cleared within 30 days. Desperate to keep panic at bay, Tolu grabbed her battered phone and skimmed through online classifieds. Every available property was far too expensive for her meager savings. Even the cheapest listings demanded a rent she simply couldn't afford. A sudden hiss from the kitchenette pulled her from her worries. Heart pounding, she leapt from bed to find a pot of beans boiling over on the stove. Gripping a wooden spoon, she stirred vigorously and lowered the heat, muttering, "Can't afford to waste anything now, not even a handful of beans." After salvaging her breakfast, Tolu dressed quickly, grabbed what little cash she had, and headed to her stall. On Sango City's busy street, she set up her modest wooden counter and began serving jollof rice and pepper soup to the usual rush of customers. Amid the bustle, she noticed a tall, sharply dressed man standing at her counter. His polished shoes and neatly pressed trousers were out of place among the local vendors. When he turned, his expression was one of measured curiosity. "Good morning," he said. "You must be Tolu." Surprised, she replied, "Yes. Do we know each other?" He introduced himself as Mr. Onajite. "I've heard that you run the finest roadside kitchen in Sango City," he said, his tone both flattering and probing. Tolu's guard went up, though she managed a polite nod and asked, "Would you like something to eat?" He smiled faintly. "Not yet. I'm more interested in discussing your plans for this business, especially given the new government regulations." His words sent a shiver down her spine. Though the regulations were on everyone's lips, she tried to keep calm. "I finish late in the afternoon. You can come back then," she offered. Hours later, as the stall buzzed with customers, Kunle arrived for his usual lunch. Noticing the worry in her eyes, he asked, "Everything okay? You seem on edge." Tolu hesitated before recounting her encounter with Mr. Onajite and his hints about a potential solution to the looming beautification project. Kunle's protective concern was immediate. "I don't like it. People can be dangerous when they sense you're desperate," he cautioned, urging her to read every fine print before agreeing to anything. That evening, as the market quieted and Tolu cleaned her stall, she heard footsteps approaching. Mr. Onajite had returned. Under the glow of a street lamp, he joined her on a nearby bench. "I know you're worried about the new regulations," he began. "I've seen many small vendors lose their livelihoods when these projects roll out, but I believe your cooking is too good to vanish." Her pulse quickened. "So, what's the catch?" Tolu asked. He explained that he represented investors ready to help promising businesses like hers secure a proper storefront, cover renovations, and obtain necessary permits, in exchange for future repayments or a share of profits. He mentioned her family background, noting that her mother was renowned for her cooking, and hinted at secrets regarding her father. The personal nature of his comments stirred anger and unease in Tolu. "My mother raised me alone," she insisted, her voice trembling. He reassured her gently. "I only mention it because I see great potential in you. Sometimes the past finds its way back when you least expect it." Still uncertain, Tolu asked, "So, if we do this, you'll help with the costs?" "We can discuss the specifics soon," he replied, handing her a glossy business card for Onajite and Associates. "Think it over, Tolu. I'll be in touch." Left alone with his card, Tolu's mind raced. If Mr. Onajite was trustworthy, his offer could be the break she desperately needed. Yet his intimate knowledge of her family, especially her elusive father, sent a chill through her. Locking up her stall and heading home under flickering city lights, Tolu felt uncertainty cling to every step. Her mother's warm voice echoed in her memory, assuring her that her cooking would open doors. Now, with her future hanging in the balance, Tolu realized that her life was on the brink of profound change, and she wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. Morning light filtered through thin curtains as Tolu awoke with a mild shoulder ache, the lingering trace of restless, burdened dreams. Determined, she dressed quickly, eager to share Mr. Onajite's unexpected offer with Kunle, especially after his unsettling hints about her father. Outside, Sango City basked in golden, honeyed light. By the time Tolu reached her usual street corner, vendors were already shouting their deals. She set up her stall with practiced efficiency, arranging trays, pots, and ladles as familiar customers began trickling in. Yet, no matter how busy she was, the weight of the 27 days remaining before the beautification project struck her, a grim countdown to losing her stall. The lunchtime rush arrived in full force, a steady stream of locals ordering jollof rice, pepper soup, or fried plantains. While her hands moved on autopilot, her thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Onajite's polished shoes, the measured cadence of his voice, and the business card she had carefully tucked into her apron. Late in the morning, Kunle appeared, architectural plans rolled under one arm. His eyes locked onto Tolu's, and she motioned for him to wait until the queue had thinned. Once the last customer had departed with a steaming takeout bowl, they retreated to a quieter corner behind the stall. "Tell me everything," Kunle urged, arms folded. "Did Mr. Onajite show up last night?" In a measured tone, Tolu recounted the conversation. She explained how Onajite had offered to fund her move into a legitimate restaurant space. "He didn't mention a price," she said, "but he hinted it wasn't a simple loan, it was more like an investment. And he asked about my mother's cooking, and my father." Kunle's frown deepened. "Why would he be interested in your father? Did he say anything specific?" "No, just vague hints. It felt unsettling, like he knew more about my family than I do," Tolu admitted. Gently, Kunle squeezed her hand. "Be careful, Tolu. People in this city have a knack for exploiting others' vulnerabilities, but I know you don't have many options with the clock ticking." Before Tolu could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. A city official, clipboard in hand, stepped to the edge of her stall. "You're Tolu Adebayo?" he demanded. "Your grace period to vacate under the beautification project stands at 27 days. After that, fines, or worse, will follow. Understood?" "Yes," Tolu replied, her throat tightening. I'm looking for a new space." The official made a note with a decisive tap of his pen before leaving. Tolu's heart pounded as she turned to Kunle, whose alarm mirrored her own. "They're serious," he murmured, "and we're running out of time." Swallowing hard, Tolu said, "It feels like I'm trapped. Either I trust a stranger with too many questions about my past, or I lose everything." Kunle's expression turned grim. "I'll ask around about Onajite and Associates. Someone must know if he's legit." Relief flickered in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft with gratitude. As the day wore on, Tolu couldn't shake Mr. Onajite's words from her mind. "You might not know everything about your own past." Each recollection left her throat dry. She'd rarely thought about her father, after all she barely remembered him, but now his shadow loomed larger than ever. When the afternoon rush subsided, Tolu closed early, methodically stocking her supplies for the next day. She counted her bags of rice and beans, arranged containers of peppers and spices, anything to distract her from the mounting pressure. Stepping away from her peeling wooden counter, the enormity of her situation crashed back. 27 days to save her livelihood, to decide if this mysterious man was a genuine savior or a con artist preying on her desperation. As the sun sank low, Tolu merged into the flow of pedestrians on Sango City's crowded streets. Despite the uncertainty weighing on her, a spark of determination ignited inside. There had to be answers, about her father, about Mr. Onajite, and if that was the price to keep her mother's dream alive, she would face it head-on, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. The city's relentless clamor followed Tolu as she navigated cramped neighborhoods, checking addresses scribbled in her notepad. She'd asked around for potential storefronts, any space that might save her from eviction. Kunle had shared a few leads, but nothing had worked out. "Please, help me, God," she pleaded to herself. Winding through a narrow alley and sidestepping murky puddles, she reached a building marked with a lopsided "For Lease" sign. A rusted metal gate opened onto a small courtyard lined with concrete rooms. However, the moment Tolu stepped inside, her hope faded. The cramped space with its uneven floors would require renovations far beyond her means. A gaunt caretaker muttered a monthly rent that was well out of reach. Offering a polite smile, Tolu replied, "I'll think about it, sir. Thank you for your time," snapping a quick photo before slipping away. The caretaker's knowing look confirmed her suspicion. The real estate market in Sango City was unforgiving. Outside, under the scorching afternoon sun, sweat beaded on her forehead as she hurried onto the main road. All she wanted was to return to her stall and lose herself in cooking, but the looming deadline of 27 days to vacate weighed on her. Finding refuge beneath a large almond tree, she fished out Mr. Onajite's glossy business card from her apron pocket. Its gleaming edges unsettled her. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, yet the bleak alternatives left her little choice. With trembling hands, Tolu dialed the number. After 2 rings, a calm, familiar voice answered. "Tolu, I had a feeling you'd call eventually," said Mr. Onajite. Swallowing her nerves, she explained, "I've been looking at properties. Everything's out of my price range. You mentioned you could help." After a brief pause, his measured tone reassured her. "I can, yes. If you're willing to discuss details, meet me at the Riverside Cafe near Eagle Bridge this evening at 7 o'clock. Glancing at her phone, Tolu noted it was already past 3. Rushing back to her stall would mean closing early, which might upset her customers, but time was running out. "All right, I'll be there," she agreed before hurrying through the labyrinth of streets. At the stall, she found Kunle waiting on a nearby bench, rolling up architectural drawings. His face shifted from relief to concern as he saw her tense expression. "Did you find anything?" he asked. Tolu shook her head. "A place, but it's way too expensive. Like everything else, And I called Mr. Onajite. His brow furrowed. You did? I did. He wants to meet at Riverside Cafe tonight, she explained. Let me come with you just in case. You shouldn't go alone, Kunle urged. For a moment, Tolu hesitated. Part of her longed for protection, but she also needed to prove she could handle this herself. It's a public place. I'll be fine. I promise to fill you in afterward. Kunle eyed her uncertainly but nodded, adding, Just be careful and call me if anything feels off. As the day wore on, Tolu's mind wavered between the busy stall and the impending meeting. Customers ordered jollof rice, pepper soup, and fried plantains, yet she barely savored her own cooking while worrying about the future. When the sun dipped low, Tolu closed the stall early, earning a few grumbles from late customers. She locked up, gathered her ingredients, and rushed home to freshen up. By 6:30, she was on a rattling bus toward Eagle Bridge. The Riverside Cafe, a familiar spot along the winding riverfront, beckoned with soft yellow bulbs, wooden tables, and murmurs of relaxed patrons. Stepping off the bus, Tolu's stomach churned with excitement and dread. A line of palm trees led her to the patio where Mr. Onajite sat at a table by the water's edge. Dressed in a charcoal suit and holding a tall glass, he rose to greet her. Tolu, I'm glad you came, he said, pulling out a chair. After exchanging pleasantries, he asked, So, tell me about your search. Tolu described the rundown storefront and its prohibitive rent. Mr. Onajite nodded thoughtfully. I have connections with landlords who trust me to bring them good tenants, he explained confidently. Her heart pounded. If that's true, then what do you want in return? He folded his hands and proposed, Before we discuss specifics, I'd like you to see a location I have in mind. Roomy enough for a proper kitchen, in a spot out of the beautification project's reach. Tolu hesitated, torn between hope and suspicion. That sounds almost too good. Why are you doing this? His eyes held a secretive depth. I do have my reasons, Tolu. But first, trust me enough to see this place. Can you do that? Her mind raced with memories of her mother and Kunle's caution, but the countdown of 27 days pressed on her. Finally, she nodded. All right, show me the location, and we'll talk more afterward. A faint smile played on his lips as he promised, I'll arrange a viewing soon. In that charged moment, amid the shimmering river and city lights, Tolu sensed that her life was on the cusp of change, one that might unravel secrets about her family and reshape her future for better or worse. 2 days passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Tolu kept herself busy with her stall's daily routine, yet every ladle of stew and every compliment on her jollof stirred thoughts of Mr. Onajite's promise, a space big enough for a real kitchen and free from government intrusion. It was everything she'd dreamed of, though doubt still gnawed at her. Kunle noticed her restlessness during his lunch visits, his steady gaze silently asking if she needed help. Though he respected her independence, his concern was evident. Finally, as Tolu closed up shop one evening, her phone buzzed. Her heart pounded when she saw Mr. Onajite's number. Good evening, Tolu. I've arranged for you to see the property tomorrow morning if you're still interested. The address is 14 Olawal Street, near the old textile factory. Meet me there at 9, his measured voice said. Her throat went dry. Yes, of course, I'll be there, she replied, staring at the phone long after the call ended. The next step loomed before her, both exhilarating and terrifying. The following morning, Tolu rose early, battling nerves as she dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, just the right balance of casual and neat. After a quick breakfast of day-old bread and hot tea, she flagged down a kiki, tricycle, to take her across bustling Olawal Street. There she found a tidy, single-story building with large windows nestled between a half-shuttered electronics store and a vacant lot. A battered sign read, For Rent, Prime Commercial Space. The peeling paint hinted the sign had hung for a while, yet the building looked decent, with no obvious cracks, a modest veranda that might hold extra tables, and plenty of potential. Standing by the front door, Mr. Onajite, impeccably dressed as always, greeted her with a polite nod. Tolu, good to see you, he said, producing a set of keys with a soft jingle. Shall we? Her heart hammered as he pushed open the door, revealing a spacious interior with tiled floors and high ceiling fans. Dust motes danced in sunlight streaming through large windows. Empty shelves lined the walls, remnants of a previous tenant, while a small storeroom on one side looked perfect for storing ingredients. In the back, a separate area hinted at a real kitchen. Tolu took a hesitant step forward, imagining colorful walls, a serving counter, and a few tables where patrons could dine. Although the space needed work, a fresh coat of paint, better lighting, a proper stove, it was within reach. "It's more than I expected," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Onajite inspected the walls. "The bones are good," he said. "The rent is manageable, especially with an investor. You'd need renovation funds, permits, and equipment, but this location is exempt from the beautification project. You'd be safe here." The word safe resonated like a lifeline. No more daily fear of officials shutting her down, no more a cramped roadside stall. She allowed herself to dream. A proper establishment featuring her mother's recipes, neighbors coming in for her signature pepper soup, and a bright sign reading, "Tolu's Kitchen." "Thank you for showing me this," she finally managed. "It's wonderful. But I must be honest, I don't have the savings for such an overhaul." He pulled out his phone briefly before tucking it away. "That's what I'm here for. I can provide the capital to secure the lease and fund the renovations. In return, we'd set up a profit-sharing agreement for a set period." Her breath caught. "Profit sharing?" she echoed. "How long would that last?" He shrugged slightly. "We'll negotiate. Perhaps 3 years, maybe 5. There's also one more condition." Tolu stiffened. "Yes?" He continued softly. "I'd like to discuss your father. We have overlapping histories that might help build mutual trust." A rush of conflicting emotions flooded her: curiosity, apprehension, and indignation that he tied her father to the deal. Yet, this might be the key to her future. After a moment, she forced a steady composure. "Fine. Tell me what you know, and then we'll see about signing." Mr. Onajite gestured toward an empty storeroom door. "Let's sit. We have a lot to discuss." In that dust-filled sunlight, Tolu braced herself for revelations that might reshape her business, her future, and the long-buried mystery of her father's life. Dust motes danced in the warm light of the empty storeroom as Tolu lowered herself onto a wooden crate. Her pulse quickened as she eyed Mr. Onajite, who sat calmly on an upturned paint bucket. Even in this shabby space, he exuded an air of quiet authority. From outside, the distant clamor of midday traffic reminded Tolu of her busy stall, the sizzling pans, the chatter of customers, and the comforting routine she'd grown to depend on. Now, she was on the verge of trading that familiarity for a new venture and an unsettling conversation about her father. "All right, I'm listening," she said softly. Mr. Onajite folded his hands, his voice echoing slightly on the tiled floor. "I knew your father back in the day," he began. "We were business associates, working together on a restaurant project." Tolu straightened, heart pounding. No one had ever given her concrete details about her father, only vague stories and half-spoken anecdotes from her mother. "What kind of project?" she asked. "A restaurant," he replied with a wry smile. She blinked, her heart thudding. "A restaurant?" He nodded. "Your father had a dream much like yours. He wanted to open a place that would do justice to your mother's recipes. She cooked while he handled the business side." Tolu tried to picture it. Her mother, vibrant and determined, stirring a pot of jollof while her father managed finances. It was an image both familiar and painfully distant. "So, why didn't it happen? My mother and I have struggled all our lives. If he was serious, why—" She trailed off, the ache in her chest growing. Mr. Onajite sighed heavily. "Your father was a visionary, but he lacked resources. I saw potential in his ideas and invested. We found a property and planned renovations, but he couldn't repay his debts. They piled up and he vanished before anything was finalized. By then, your mother was left to pick up the pieces." Tolu's thoughts spun. She had assumed her father had left out of selfishness or fear. Now, the notion that he'd been a dreamer crushed by debt struck her deeply. "He never came back. He never contacted me or my mother," she murmured. Softly, Mr. Onajite added, "He died not long after, an accident, or so I heard. I tried to trace him, but the trail went cold. Your mother never spoke to me again. I suspect she blamed me for your father's downfall." A mix of grief, confusion, and anger churned inside Tolu. "She never mentioned any of this," she whispered, hugging herself. "I stopped asking when I got older, thinking it was too painful." Mr. Onajite nodded in sorrow. "She was protective of you. Perhaps she felt he abandoned both of you. I hold no ill will against your family. I only regret not doing more to help them." Silence fell as Tolu absorbed this new portrait of her father, a flawed dreamer who loved her mother's cooking enough to risk everything, yet left them in financial ruin. Finally, she asked, "So, now you're helping me? Why? Out of guilt? Out of pity?" He looked at her, eyes earnest. "Because your mother's legacy deserves a proper stage. You have real talent. I saw what your parents could have built, and I refuse to let you lose that chance." Tolu's heart pounded with conflicting emotions. "This is your way of making things right?" "If you'll let me," he replied, softening his tone. "I've secured this property and can provide the capital for renovations. I propose a formal agreement, clear terms, timelines, profit shares, no secrets, no hidden debts." He paused, adding quietly, "I won't pressure you for a decision today, but time is short." Her mind flashed back to the official's cold words, 27 days. "All right," she said finally, exhaling shakily. "Let's see the paperwork, and then I'll decide." A flicker of relief crossed his face. Rising from the bucket, he offered his hand. "Come, let's step outside and go over the documents. I have my laptop in the car." Tolu took his hand, a swirl of emotions washing over her. Part of her wanted to run from this painful confrontation of her past, yet the pragmatic dreamer within knew this might be her only chance to save her mother's legacy. They stepped out into the main room, where sunlight streamed through large glass windows, illuminating dust and possibility alike. As Tolu paused by the door, she envisioned a vibrant space filled with the aroma of pepper soup and the laughter of happy customers. Could this be the second chance her parents never had? With a steadying breath, she squared her shoulders and followed Mr. Onajite, knowing that whatever lay ahead, her life was about to change forever. Tolu stepped out of the vacant shop into the bright mid-morning sun, squinting as her eyes adjusted to the glare. Mr. Onajite led her across the cracked pavement to a sleek, dark sedan parked by the curb, a striking contrast to the rundown buildings and faded signs around them. He opened the passenger door and motioned for her to sit. Though her pulse quickened with old fears of the unknown, Tolu summoned her courage and slid into the seat. Mr. Onajite joined her, setting a slim laptop bag on his lap. Inside, the car was cool and hushed, a welcome cocoon from the city's clamor. The faint scent of leather and citrus filled the space. Tolu gripped her knees, reminding herself she was there to review legal documents, not to sign away her soul. Mr. Onajite opened his laptop and said, "I've drafted an initial agreement. It's not final, but it outlines my investment and what I expect in return." He navigated through files until a contract template filled the screen. Tolu scanned rows of text. Rent allowance, profit-sharing ratio, renovation fund. The profits for the first 3 years would split 60-40 in her favor, with Mr. Onajite covering rent, renovations, and 2 months' overhead. Then she'd handle monthly expenses from the restaurant's revenue. Her eyes lingered on a clause in additional terms. In unforeseen financial hardship, Mr. Onajite could recoup his investment before any profit was shared. Her stomach clenched. "This means if the restaurant struggles, you take your investment back before I see any profit, right?" she asked. Nodding gravely, he replied, "That's the standard safeguard. But I believe in your cooking. I don't intend to strangle the business. It's in both our interests for it to flourish." Tolu's mind raced with memories of her father's failed venture, and she wondered if she was stepping into the same trap. Glancing through the tinted window at the worn buildings of Olawale Street, she pictured her future establishment brimming with patrons, the aroma of pepper soup filling the air, yet shadowed by the risk of financial ruin. After a long moment, she cleared her throat. "I'd want a lawyer to review this," she said, voice trembling with apprehension. "I don't have one, but maybe Kunle knows someone." Mr. Onajite offered a small smile. "Absolutely. I encourage it. I want our partnership to be transparent." He then produced a printed copy of the contract neatly stapled at the corner and handed it to her. "Take this with you. Mark any changes you want. Once we're both satisfied, we can sign." Tolu accepted the document with unsteady fingers, its weight symbolic of her future. "Thank you," she mumbled, folding the contract carefully and slipping it into her purse. A rush of city noise filtered in as Mr. Onajite opened his door. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, "but the property owner is eager to lease quickly. Let me know your decision soon. We may have only a week or two before someone else signs." Her throat tightened. "I understand." Handing her a glossy business card, he added, "Call me if you have questions. And if you need more clarity, I'm willing to talk about your father. I know that's important to you." Tolu watched him step back into his car, the engine purring as it pulled away. Left on the scarred sidewalk were the contract and the lingering offer to finally learn the truth about her father's past. The midday sun glared as Tolu walked to the nearest bus stop. The contract weighed on her mind, and each step intensified the conflict between hope and caution inside her. By the time she reached her stall, customers were already gathering for lunch. She couldn't afford distractions. A misstep could ruin a day's work. Kunle arrived as she served office workers carrying a brown envelope. Lowering his voice later, he said, "I looked into that land deal. Some call it a prime space, others say it's a dead zone. Hard to get foot traffic." Tolu grimaced. "I just saw it. The building's all right, but it needs work." She hesitated before adding, "Let's talk later. I have something to show you." After the lunch rush, they met in a quiet courtyard beneath a mango tree. Tolu handed Kunle the contract, and as he examined it, he murmured, "He's offering you a head start. Rent, renovations, overhead. But there's a clause about recouping his investment if things go south. And he mentioned your father." Tolu explained the story. The failed restaurant, mounting debts, her father's disappearance, and rumored death. Kunle warned, "He's righting past wrongs, but you must ensure you're not stepping into the same snare." With less than 3 weeks left on her stall's lease, Tolu sighed. "We'll take this to a lawyer, then decide what's best." Kunle squeezed her shoulder gently. "I know someone in small business law. Let's set up a meeting." Despite the anxiety, a flicker of hope stirred within her. Perhaps this was the path to saving her mother's legacy. Standing up, Tolu brushed off her apron and smiled at Kunle. Together, they headed back toward her stall, aware that beneath the routine hustle of Sango City, everything was about to change. Amid the hustle, Kunle arrived carrying a brown envelope. After serving a group of office workers, Tolu stepped aside to speak with him privately. "I met with a lawyer today," Kunle said as they stood beneath a blossoming frangipani tree in a quiet courtyard. "Barrister Okoro looked over the contract. He confirmed that Mr. Onajite is offering you a head start, rent, renovations, and initial overhead costs in exchange for a share of the profits. But there's a clause that allows him to recoup his investment if business goes south. More worryingly, he wants the right to oversee major financial decisions." Tolu's eyes filled with apprehension as she explained, "I was told my creative freedom would be protected. I want to safeguard my mother's recipes and my brand. I can't risk signing away too much control." Kunle nodded. Okoro suggested negotiating clearer boundaries, perhaps capping his oversight or ensuring you retain final say on key decisions. It's not predatory, but you must be cautious. Relief mixed with lingering fear as Tolu examined the revised list of suggested changes. "I'm nervous, but at least I'm not walking in blind anymore," she admitted softly. Kunle offered an encouraging smile. "You're one step closer to making your dream real. Let's set up a meeting with my friend in small business law to go over these changes in detail." Standing together on the sidewalk, Tolu clutched the folder containing the contract, feeling its weight as a reminder of how swiftly life could change. She reached for Kunle's hand, grateful for his steady presence. "Thank you," she whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." With newfound resolve, Tolu vowed to protect her mother's legacy while carving out her own future. The next steps were uncertain, But with legal guidance and Kunle's support, she was ready to negotiate the terms and see if Mr. Onajite's offer could truly be the fresh start she desperately needed. Tolu spent the rest of the afternoon oscillating between shaky excitement and mild dread. The proposed amendments were safely tucked in her bag, a tangible step toward securing her future. Yet, a dozen questions looped in her mind. Would Mr. Onajite accept her lawyer's changes? Would he balk at granting her so much control? And, most troublingly, could she trust a man whose past was tied to her father's downfall? By sundown, business at her stall had slowed. The last few customers chatted over plates of spicy jollof while Kunle lingered nearby, aware of the turmoil behind her eyes but giving her space to breathe. "You should reach out to him soon. Let him know you've got the lawyer's feedback," Kunle advised softly as Tolu wiped down the counter. She paused, then nodded. "I know. I just need to gather my courage." With Kunle's reassuring presence beside her, she retrieved her phone and tapped Mr. Onajite's contact. The phone rang twice before his smooth voice answered. "Tolu, good evening," he said. "Good evening, sir. I've had a lawyer review the contract. There are a few points I'd like to negotiate before signing," she replied, steadying herself. After a brief pause, he said, "Of course. That's expected. Shall we meet tomorrow to discuss?" "Yes, please. Where would you like to—" "Come to my office. I'll text you the address. 10 o'clock?" Tolu agreed, her heart thumping. As soon as the call ended, Kunle gave her a thumbs up. "You see? He didn't hesitate. That's a good sign." Still, the apprehension lingered. Nothing was final yet, and Mr. Onajite was a shrewd businessman, even with his connection to her father. The next morning, Tolu temporarily closed her stall and made her way across Sango City by bus and then on foot through a district of sleek office complexes. Plush palm trees lined the sidewalks, and shiny name plaques adorned the building entrances. A text from Mr. Onajite confirmed the suite number. She entered a modern steel and glass building and was directed to the 4th floor by a smiling receptionist. In the elevator, her reflection showed uncertainty, but she straightened her posture thinking, "I have to own this decision if I'm to make my restaurant dream come true." On the 4th floor, she found a glass door labeled Onajite and Associates. In a minimalist waiting area, an assistant greeted her and led her into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A polished wooden desk occupied one end, but Mr. Onajite rose to greet her with a warm, professional smile and motioned for her to sit in chairs near the windows. "Good to see you again, Tolu. So, you have some changes you'd like to discuss?" he asked. She handed him a thin folder containing Barrister Okoro's notes and revised clauses. "Yes, mainly around creative control, branding, and the extent of your oversight if profits dip." He scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. After a long silence filled only by the hum of the air conditioner, he said, "These requests are reasonable. I expected something like this. I only have a few concerns." He explained, "You want full autonomy on menu decisions and daily operations. I'd like the right to suggest changes if the restaurant underperforms, but the final decision should remain yours." Tolu agreed, relieved to hear he was willing to negotiate boundaries. "As for branding, you'll retain full ownership of Tolu's kitchen and your mother's recipes," he added. Tolu's chest tightened with pride and apprehension. They spent 20 minutes refining the language, ensuring there were no hidden fees or clauses that would tie her hands. When Mr. Onajite drew up the revised contract and printed it, they reviewed it together until Tolu felt confident nothing had been overlooked. "If everything looks good, we can sign now, or you can have your lawyer do a final check," Mr. Onajite offered. Gazing at the final draft, Tolu recalled her father's failures and her mother's sacrifices. Taking a deep breath, she said firmly, "I'd like to sign now. I'm satisfied with the changes." He signed next and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Tolu. You've taken your first step toward building something extraordinary. I'm honored to be part of it." "Thank you," she replied, shaking his hand as the weight of the signed contract settled on her. Outside the office, as she stepped back into the bustling city, Tolu knew that though the future held risks and unanswered questions, she was determined to protect her mother's legacy and forge her own path in Sango City. Tolu stepped onto the city sidewalk with the freshly signed contract tucked safely in her bag, the midday sun beating down on her. The traffic noise swirled around as she made her way to the nearest bus stop. Pedestrians hurried past, and she felt both part of and apart from the bustling crowd, still absorbing the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. The tension of the past weeks remained, though now it was intermingled with a flicker of possibility. A real restaurant. She no longer would be merely a roadside stall vendor, constantly threatened by city ordinances. Soon, she would have walls, windows, and a sign proudly displaying her name. The future, once so constricted, now felt wide open. She boarded a battered yellow bus, squeezing into a seat between an elderly woman balancing a basket of produce and a talkative teenager. As city landmarks, markets, towering office buildings, vivid murals whizzed by, Tolu found herself viewing the city with new eyes, imagining her own contribution to its patchwork. Eventually, the bus stopped near her familiar street corner. She hopped off, thanked the driver, and hurried back to her stall. A small line of late-lunch regulars had formed, and Tolu felt a pang of guilt for leaving Kunle to manage the queue alone. Still, joy bubbled within her at the sight of familiar faces gathered for a meal. "Finally! People have been asking where you ran off to," Kunle called out as he spotted her. A customer, puzzled, added, "We thought you moved already." Tolu laughed softly. "Not yet, Uncle Bala, but hopefully soon." She gestured for Kunle to pass the ladle and whispered her gratitude for covering her shift. Then, in a quieter moment behind the counter, Kunle asked, "So, did you sign?" Blushing with warmth, she nodded. "Yes, everything's official now. I'll explain after we serve these folks." As she returned to her work, her heart thrummed with anticipation. The lunch crowd kept her busy. Orders for pepper soup and jollof flowed steadily while customers complimented her cooking and gossiped about local happenings. Yet, between each plate served, Tolu's mind kept returning to the vacant shop on Olawale Street, to the promise and potential it held. When the rush finally subsided, she and Kunle retreated to a shady spot behind the stall where the noise of traffic was muffled by a makeshift tarp. "Now tell me everything. How did it go?" Kunle urged softly. Pressing a hand to her chest, Tolu said, "He accepted all the lawyer's changes, creative control over the menu, full rights to my recipes, and a fair profit split. We both signed." Kunle let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's really good. I was half expecting him to fight on some points." A mixture of disbelief and relief passed over Tolu's face. "Me too, but he was surprisingly accommodating," she replied. Kunle's tone turned cautious. "Remember, he's a businessman. He might be banking on the long-term success of your place." Tolu nodded. "I know. For now, it seems we're on the same page." The warmth in Kunle's eyes made her cheeks sting. "I'm proud of you. This is huge," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm a little terrified," Tolu admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father failed trying to do the same thing, but maybe I can succeed where he couldn't." Kunle's reassuring grip steadied her. "You've got something he didn't, your mother's legacy and your own determination, plus a community that believes in your cooking." Their brief moment of connection was interrupted by the growing crowd outside. "We should get back to work. People are hungry," Kunle reminded her. Tolu smiled. "Right. Let's feed them. Chef Tolu has to keep her reputation while we still have this stall." Back at the front, with orders flying in, Tolu felt a renewed determination. She had a clear vision now: finalize the lease, plan renovations, and transition from the roadside stall to her own restaurant. As she served customers and sketched rough layouts for the new place on scraps of paper, each step affirmed that she was stepping into the future her mother had always believed in. Yet, as the sun dipped lower, a flicker of doubt tugged at her. "I've taken a leap of faith," she thought. "I just hope I've landed on solid ground." And though Mr. Onajite's insistence on his connection to her father still loomed as an unanswered mystery, Tolu embraced the moment. With Kunle by her side and her dream now tangible in her hands, she walked home into the evening, ready to forge a future defined by hope, resilience, and the promise of a new beginning. Thank you for watching and listening to this short story. What would you do if you were Tolu? Subscribe and like for more stories like this.